Thank you for joining us for this conversation in conjunction with the Mai production of Lloyd Suh's play, The Chinese Lady, at the Public Theater in New York City. I'm Nancy Davis, and I'm here with Jack Chen.
I've been really happy to have this conversation. It's kind of rare to talk about a shared interest with another historian that's really about also a play that's being put on, but also about the book and the research that you were involved in. And we should really say that oftentimes that's really how otherwise kind of silenced stories and forgotten stories really kind of emerge to the point that a playwright or a filmmaker can actually do something with that. So I just wanted to kind of appreciate the work and research, the very hard digging around of little bits and pieces of fragments about this woman who we really have known very little about, who came at the beginning of the 19th century, 1930, excuse me, I keep on getting my centuries wrong, 1830s, excuse me, and then traveled around and performed, but also appeared in New York, and that's where the focus of that performance of being put on stage in a kind of Orientalist, very Orientalist way happened, but then you followed through the bits and pieces of evidence of playbills, of photographs, I mean, not photographs, but drawings that were circulated to reconstruct her life. And I'd really just as a historian love for you, if you don't mind, to kind of reconstruct a little bit of that, the work that was required to do that, and really then what it begins to reveal, I think, about the time and the shifting nature of the time that she was circulating around the country, but also she went to Cuba and other places as well. So it'd be great to hear a little bit about that.
Afong Moy was really the first Chinese person to have any wide public recognition. So Americans previous to that had never seen a Chinese person really up close. That experience for her as a really young woman, possibly she was as young as 16, but more likely maybe 18 or 19, coming to America with bound feet, sort of forced to come, and coming because she was brought by American merchants who are New York merchants, coming because they wanted to promote their less expensive Chinese goods to a middle-class America. During that time, as you mentioned, she traveled across the United States. This would be going south, going to Cuba, going up the Mississippi River, going to the Northeast, a huge amount of travel for a really young woman. I saw her really in many ways as kind of a bridge at first, bringing information to the American public about China. She did have an interpreter who could help her do that. And then later, as a foil, because she provided Americans a way to compare her life and her experience as a woman and her experience as a Chinese person with America. And so in that way, Americans saw her as a foil and probably used her a bit that way. And then in the later part of her life, we sort of see her as a window into the way Americans perceive China. Her first several years, as you say, Jack, were ones where she presented herself on stage amidst a lot of goods, inexpensive goods that Americans might want to buy. People saw her in a rather positive way, as you've expressed, that sort of commercial Orientalism, seeing her as a way to look at Oriental goods, seeing her as an exotic, seeing her as sort of beautiful, and also seeing China as a place with a lot of great historicity and revered history. The challenge in this book was to see the real change that occurs in her life. Part of that has to do with the 1837 panic that hit New York City really hard. Merchants went bankrupt. Her experience on stage, of course, gave way because people didn't want to pay to go to the theater. And she sadly was put in a poorhouse in New Jersey for 8 years. So that kind of research was really fascinating to understand how she got there, who put her there, what her experience was in New Jersey. She had comment to make about her experience in New Jersey because people found her there and wondered, what is she doing here? Why is she here? And she was very willing to say, I was brought here and against my will, and I want to go back. The public in New Jersey and really across the nation took up her cause. There were a lot of articles about Afong Moy and the injustice of putting her in a poorhouse that did sort of out the people who caused her to go to the poorhouse and made them pay for a bit more care than she might have gotten otherwise. But she still was there for 8 years. And when she came out, which was again another second half of her story, she met a really great difference. And I think one of the things that you and I can talk about is this really great upheaval in American life at this point, sort of being in the crosshairs of slavery and Native American removal and nativism and the more reform movement, all these things she met, and sometimes very up close.
Thanks for that framing, because I think her life and her story really puts kind of blood and flesh onto the very dramatic events of the 19th century that, quite frankly, Americans tend not to pay much attention to. We're caught up in certain kind of founding narratives, the founding fathers, I mean, the things that we learned in grade school, basically. And I think it's a little better now, but it's still kind of there a lot, and, because history is only taught in such a, from my point of view, a limited way, it's not engaging. And I think there are some great teachers out there now who are making a difference, but it tends to be a bit about certain kinds of moments that we remember. The 19th century kind of drops out. It's kind of industrialization and the Civil War, and maybe P.T. Barnum pops up now that Julian Fellows, who did Downton Abbey, is doing the Gilded Age. We're kind of noticing the Gilded Age and the rivalry on railroads. But in many ways, the real stories, the real dramas, I think, are people like Afong Moy, who have been kind of largely effaced and not paid any serious attention, in part because it's really difficult doing the research, but also there's kind of a paradigm in which the lives of someone such as her were not considered important compared to, usually, as we both have emerged from doing history, kind of the kind of patriarchs and matriarchs of history, but the everyday life, social and cultural history tends not to be kind of paid attention to. But I think what's really great, so you're a public historian, which I think means that we're, and so am I, which means that we're not strictly focused on academic specialization and hyper specialization, but we're really interested in kind of having our stories have an impact with a broader public through exhibits, through films, through dialogues like this, through plays, So for me, by your having dug this up about Afong Moy, it really helps us understand what was going on through the life of one person, of larger events, not just of the United States. Unfortunately, so much of history is just nationally oriented, so that we only look at one country and not others. But her life, as you say, bridges what's going on from where she came in the Canton area, in the Guangzhou area, and what's happening with U.S. merchants and traders, and therefore what happens in that cross-cultural context, which in some ways sets up, I think, a really important frame. I mean, this is the work I've been doing and we've been both kind of involved in how U.S.-China relations have shifted and changed over the decades, and how at this earlier moment, in the context of the China trade and the British and Americans wanting desperately, and Europeans wanting desperately to go to China to get in the queue outside of the Canton merchant settlement to be able to be first or early in line to get the best luxury goods from China. And then her background in the 1830s also is in the context of the emergence of the Opium Wars, in which the British basically wage economic and economic war with China through the introduction of a highly addictive drug that basically destroys China's economy. It'd be fun to maybe talk a little bit about what you dug up in terms of what her possible background is. I mean, we don't always know for sure because of the lack of records, but I think that context would be really helpful. And I think what you found and what you're suggesting as possibilities would be really good for people to understand.
It was very difficult. I did spend time in Guangzhou in the archives trying to locate Afong Moy, and didn't find anything in the newspapers or any information about the transfer of Afong Moy to the Auberts. Afong Moy could not have been put on a ship unless she had a chaperone. The captain's wife, Augusta Aubert, was on board the ship and would serve as a chaperone for Afong Moy. But what was really fascinating was that Augusta Aubert then went to Guangzhou, which was absolutely verboten, really. No woman was allowed into the city because it was just a trading center and very closely monitored. But she did go into the city, and it's recorded such much later that she was the first, and probably she was actually the second, because there was someone else had gone in a little bit earlier and then was thrown out. But Augusta was the first woman, American woman, to go into the city, and then brought her out. So that's the way Afong Moy came to America. The question was, who was she? Likely she was a daughter of a merchant who was probably trading in some way with the Americans. Likely also she would have been of that status because she had bound feet. It seemed as though this was a very difficult time in Guangzhou because there had been a lot of floods and there had been a lot of misery. And it's very possible that, in fact, the parents were having a very difficult time, her parents having a very difficult time. And this may have been a way to, earn some money, because much later in America, we see a notice of the fact that monies were apparently transferred to her parents, and a great deal of money. And so in effect, she was, bound to this, this promise of coming to America, perhaps because things were really bad in Guangzhou at the time.
Just to provide a little context of kind of US-China relationships and British-China relationships, and then why, and the reason why China was as closed down as it had been. First of all, they were the Manchus who had occupied China, and they were basically imposing their rule on China, so that China itself was going through a very complex period of being dominated for hundreds of years already, and had its own history of relations to the larger world. A lot of the coastal trade was already happening between China and Southeast Asia, although in many ways there are prohibitions about kind of opening up to the larger Western world. Part of this is because I think there was already a great deal of awareness of what the British were doing in India, for example. Oftentimes there's the kind of representation of China being an isolated insular nation, and it's really more complicated story because of the Silk Roads, the multiple roads. There's a lot of internal land-bound trade, but also there was the coastal trade to so much of other parts of Asia going on. But the Western representation of China was that it was just closed off from the West, and part of it was a protective attitude. Part of it was a certain kind of attitude about not wanting to open up to the world in a way that would really force the country to shift its focus on who it was and what it was doing. The Western ships, I mean, so the first ship of the new nation coming out of New York City after the revolution was the Empress of China leaving the port of New York. So New York increasingly becomes kind of a major port. Also, in continuation of the fascination and interest that the kind of colonials, those who are kind of becoming increasingly born in the U.S., but many of them deeply influenced still by the Dutch and the British culture and the colonization of the mid-Atlantic surrounding the New York region. And you know what was going on, let's say, in terms of, let's say, George Washington, even as a general, and him being obsessed with, even in the middle of the fight against the British, the Revolutionary War, being obsessed in New York to have his headquarters table with the proper kinds of Chinese imported porcelains, the latest porcelains, right? So we're talking about this kind of complicated set of stories in which these goods, these objects that you also focus on, we both focus on objects, we're both kind of obsessed with these objects and the meaning of the objects, right? And how they're used and how the objects themselves begin to drive certain notions of what being a proper gentleman or a proper self-possessed, self-owning person might be, and what having those possessions surrounding oneself does to distinguish oneself in the context of polite society. You know, so the Gilded Age questions are actually going all the way back, right, to British culture and Dutch culture. That kind of desire for those luxury goods oftentimes are confused with actual people, so that George Washington, his headquarters being more on the west side of Lower Manhattan, and then he would give orders to his quote unquote Chinaman, which is over on the east side of Lower Manhattan. And this was not a Chinese person, it was a British person, not of Chinese descent, selling Chinaware. And he was called a Chinaman. So the things become associated with people, in effect. And this kind of switching back and forth with Afong Moy on stage and the things surrounding her and selling things is a theme that goes back to that earlier period as well. So I think part of what's really interesting about these framings is that we see the continuities, and what happens to one person at one time is also happening in other moments of time, and they link these historical contexts. But just to get back to the Opium War for a second, so the her context of emerging from China at a time in which the British and all the colonial empires who are able to send out ships, which are including the Portuguese who are dominating Macau, the Spanish who have occupied the Philippines, and all the other European powers, you know, France, Germany, but especially England, who have the biggest ship fleet and are the most dominant in terms of their empire building, even more than the Dutch, who they've eclipsed, are really vying for these luxury goods, and they're constantly struggling to find what are the things that China wants. Part of the interest of establishing toeholds in the New World, so-called, and dispossessing indigenous people and enslaving African peoples was really to kind of treat the Northeast and Atlantic coastline as ways of extracting the so-called natural resources that could be then used in the global trade. And part of the effort to answer the question of what did China want and how could we build things to get to China in terms of the wood and the oak that was largely gone and disappeared from Europe and the building of the British Empire. So in some ways, the New World was not so much a land of opportunity that individual Englishmen and Dutch people could then just have their own plot of land, but so much of it was driven by the larger economic interest of the maritime trade and the colonization. That context, I think, helps us understand a little bit more about really the interrelated natures of not so much an isolated insular China, but a China that was actually quite dynamic, one of the really the biggest economy in the world. There were thousands and hundreds of thousands of of craftspeople living throughout, working throughout southern China, making things that the international trade wanted. And opium became really the main means in which that balance of trade and what China wanted could be reversed. And it really did succeed in the sense of basically addicting whole parts of the population and collapsing so much of the economy. And that all took place in this one little area in Canton, in which there's a little area of Canton which is really set aside for the Western merchants to live. And they were not meant to go too much into the city. And it was gender segregated so that the men could occasionally go to the surrounding areas and explore. But the women were not considered desirable to do that, in part because of the concern about, I think, the foreigners starting to settle and create families and actually penetrating into the Chinese culture itself. So I just wanted to set that up a little bit so that we have that backdrop. But just to get back to Afong Moy, I think you're absolutely right that it was not typical for women to travel. If anything, there would have been sailors, occasionally some merchants, traveling back and forth. We don't necessarily have the full stories of who was traveling when, but you've been touching on that, and some of the new research that's being done is really trying to get at those stories. Missionaries, merchants, politicians, diplomats were clearly a part of those early efforts. And once the Opium War really hits, with the first Opium War, so-called First Opium War in 1839, and the Second Opium War later in the 40s, that begins to change the dynamics greatly of US-China relations and Anglo-American relations. So in some ways, Afong Moy comes at the cusp in which that shift from what I've kind of called patrician Orientalism begins to shift over towards a commercial Orientalism in which the things begin to dominate. And it's really, in some ways, the luxury items become just more accessible, more affordable, middle class, and more popular things. I think if you were to talk a little bit about the Carnes brothers and their innovations in the context of New York, Paris, and the Caribbean, that would actually be really helpful, because I think that begins to connect up with this kind of Atlantic world that we're actually trying to describe.
In order to understand the Carnes and how they were inventing this or thinking through this process, I should say that I needed to go back and understand their family history. Nathaniel Carnes was one of the cousins. It was Nathaniel and also Francis, who together developed this mercantile organization that brought Afong Moy. Nathaniel's father, Louis, actually did not live in the United States very much. He lived off the coast of South America in the 18th century. So he had a shop in Boston, but most of his life was spent in Demerara, which is now Guyana, and off the coast of South America, trading in sugar and cotton. And Nathaniel, the person who ultimately brings Afong Moy to New York, also grew up off the coast of South America, understanding the process of the Atlantic trade. So he was very familiar with the global trade of the time. And then he was also on his uncle's ship going to China. So he knew about trade with China. His brother, Francis, went to Harvard, but then settled in Paris. And they joined as a company, Nathaniel in New York and Francis in Paris. And this became an international company. You might wonder, what is Francis doing and what is his importance in Paris? Well, he would look around, and also he was very involved in the cultural life of Paris, and he would see the goods that were being shipped from Paris to New York. And I sort of developed this idea of the Y trade. He, in fact, shipped things that, like perfumes, and various small goods to China, had them manufactured in China, perfumes and small things, and then shipped to New York. And it undercut the French market, the French fancy goods, the French perfumes. So all these things that he found were very popular in Paris were manufactured in China, then brought to New York, as I said, and then really sort of blew the market out for other goods that were more expensive. Nathaniel knew the everyday sort of inexpensive mats and blinds and small goods that were coming in bits and pieces, not very much, fireworks and fans and small pieces, small furniture, small goods. And he just fills his vessels with these small goods instead of more expensive goods, antique. And so he floods the market in New York. And he can do that, and they can do that, because in the 1830s, New York was very hospitable to merchants, to American merchants. Their tax rate was lower than other ports, and also it required the auctioneer to pay the duties on Chinese goods. And that, of course, was very popular for merchants. So they were hitting a market in New York that was unlike any other market in America. And they did immensely well. And they could afford to bring Afong Moy to America to sort of hawk and promote these goods. So it was really fascinating to look at the whole breadth of the Atlantic trade and why these people, why these two merchants knew how to do this, because they've been brought up considering the Atlantic trade.
This work on the Carnes family is so important, because we tend to, certainly I've tended to think of, oh, these luxury goods, the well-to-do, high-end merchants, the people who are trying to emulate the aristocracy, and the aristocracy's interest in the China trade and the very fine, expensive goods, and also aesthetically really trying to emulate the aristocracy, so that if the aristocracy had specially designed plates and porcelains or other designs for their taste and their interest, they would have that order be done in China and custom made in those workshops that were in southern China. You get porcelains and other kinds of tastes really circulating very broadly in American culture, which is less aristocratic and more kind of quote unquote democratic, so that the taste culture kind of expands, so that you get this middle brow, middle class emerging culture, which are trying to emulate the elites, their betters. And George Washington is both kind of aristocratic in his style, but also Republican in his style as well. So you have a little bit more fluidity in a US context as the colonies are emerging and becoming the new nation. In some ways, there's this kind of combination in which George Washington is still carrying on the taste of that he's been brought up with, and that his father had, and their surveyors really charting the territory of Indian lands and really foreshadowing the expansion of the colonies into that land by charting it out and turning it into property lots, right? So you have this combination of economic development, but also the trade, the tastes that are driven by the international trade. Just to kind of zoom forward a little bit, so you get an American author such as Edith Wharton, who we tend to think of as, comparable to Henry James, kind of writing about American taste and elite culture, the Gilded Age. And one of her first books is really a guide for the emerging American elites who are making money. Again, the Gilded Age elites, the earlier generations. Before Mrs. Astor became part of that kind of elite society, she was aspiring to kind of move upward in New York society, right? The older money didn't really even want anything to do with her. She was just a merchant, had nothing to do with that older early American culture. But Edith Wharton is writing a guidebook about European taste and European furniture and fabrics that then these kind of clumsy nouveau riche in the States could begin to learn from. So in some ways, it's a foreshadowing of what begins to emerge in the Gilded Age TV show. Okay,
Yeah.
So that kind of rivalry in terms of taste culture is in many ways is driving what the China trade is all about. First, in terms of things that China is making on its own terms, but then increasingly how the elites are contracting Chinese to make custom-made goods, to the point where we get to Afong Moy, where these are knockoffs. These are things that are not as expensive and more cheaply produced by all these small workshops in China for the more middlebrow trade, in which you can buy your blue and white porcelains, but they're really made cheaply. And you get also the British, American, and French and German porcelain makers who finally figure out how to make porcelain after trying to do it for many, many decades. And they're making imitation chinoiserie, Japanese, kind of Chinese and Japanese like things that are really imitations of what China is able to do. So this whole thing about copying and capitalism as it's really expanding through the Atlantic world is really copying back and forth and trying to circulate luxury goods, but more middle-class goods, also, and then people are being trafficked increasingly in that context as well, right? So I just kind of wanted to place it within that, because really the stories that we're most concerned about are the politics and the geopolitics. In some ways today, just to kind of zoom ahead a little bit, we're going through a similar time period in which the Chinese economy has become really the second, has become actually larger than the United States, but in terms of the individual per capita kind of wealth, it's far poorer than that of the United States, but it's a very dynamic economy that's expanding massively. And China goods and China-made goods are both now on the luxury high end of electronics, contracted by multinational corporations, but also seen as the source of cheap goods that are made. But we're in a very dynamic, fluctuating period that's comparable perhaps to this earlier period in which geopolitics are highly unstable. And as we now zoom towards the United States, and lots of the politicians and tastemakers are thinking about China as a potential enemy and rival to the United States in capitalist terms, then it helps us, I think, understand that these cycles have deep historical roots in this earlier period, and they always involve things and goods and people, and the way stereotypes also happen upon those people. So just getting back to Afong Moy again, so that in some ways, I mean, so she's traveling around New York and the United States and the stage, becoming really the personification of someone who can hawk the goods, as you say, for the Carnes family and make their money. And then they hit the skids in terms of the economy. Yeah. Maybe you could kind of describe one of the performances a little bit, because that's what's represented in the play. And then we can kind of talk about the skids, and what happens during that time period. Yeah.
Well, Afong Moy, as you will see in the play, is performing on stage. She's showing the public the clothing she wears, her feet, and Atong, who is her interpreter only for a period of 10 months, actually, so it's not a very long time, is presenting the information about China that she's showing. She's showing how one uses a teacup that doesn't have any handles. She's giving one a sense of some of the things that the Chinese would use, some of the things that actually they wouldn't use. Like they were not necessarily using a shawl, but she might show the shawl because that's what the Carnes were bringing in. She could show them a fan, and she was actually showing something that Chinese would use. So she was giving people access to the goods and how they were being used on stage. People, by and large, perceived her positively in this way because they were learning and they were seeing things that were of interest to them, both the possibility to buy them and the experience of that. I should just back up and say that New York was really important because of the Erie Canal. And these goods were by 1825 going out of New York and into the hinterlands. So it's just important to realize that they would begin to see these things and know about these things because they were being sent out. The goods, that were being sent in were things that could then pay for things that were going out. So merchants were very alert to the fact that there was money out there, and sending things out through the Erie Canal, which I think is really interesting as a New York connection, and certainly why the Carnes would want to be where they were in New York. I think what happens then is, as you mentioned, after she is put into the poorhouse and after things go on the skids with Carnes, not only do they go on the skids with the 1837 panic, but the Carnes mercantile house on William Street burn in the Great Fire, the Great New York Fire of 1837. So they're a double whammy. They're hit by the double whammy of both. So she, being out of that experience of presenting for 8 years, is brought back. And you do a lot of work on this, Jack. In your book, you talk a lot about it with the King. And I think that's a really interesting point. New Yorkers see a very different China, and they have a very different experience of what China is. And Afong Moy becomes very engaged in that whole dynamic of the King. So maybe you want to talk about the King, because I think it's a really fascinating moment in New York City life where the public is just all a chatter about what's going on with this Chinese junk coming into port.
Of course, the newspapers began to report on the Opium Wars from a certain perspective, and they're aware of that. The so-called Chinese junk arrives, is taking a trip. It's actually been purchased by, I haven't done the recent research, so I'm not sure if there are new interpretations of what happened, but by an Australian mariner, captain of some money, who's able to purchase, quote unquote, purchase this Chinese junk and begin to kind of circulate it around the Anglo kind of empire, the British Empire. So you start getting this Chinese junk that's seen as, in some ways, booty, a prize from the Opium Wars, and a way to kind of have people experience directly what Chinese culture and Chinese people are about. In some ways, it becomes a floating museum that goes from port to port and arrives in New York and causes incredible interest. People are kind of lining up, and this is a Chinese junk, and we have some prints of it that is anchored in New York Harbor, kind of off Lower Manhattan, off of Castle Clinton. And people are taking boats going back and forth and paying money. I can't remember how much it was, Nancy. You may remember, was it a quarter, 50 cents? What was it?
Yeah, I think it was 50 cents.
So it was really some money. So it wasn't just anybody who go to it, and people were dressed well. And it was like, I think maybe the comparable would be going to the Met in a more formal day in which you wear good clothing, or you're walking and strolling down Fifth Avenue. So these are the people who are kind of middle class and striving to become more upper middle, and they would go visit this junk. The crew that was on there were largely Chinese, and they were really, in many ways, meant to be kind of an extension of a stage, but a floating stage to perform and introduce people as well. And of course, you'd have translators involved in that process, but also Chinese goods, right, as part of what was on the display. This occupied the headlines of the many New York City newspapers. Newspapers at the time in New York were down in Herald Square, again referencing the Gilded Age. You have the New York Times building, which was still down there at the time. and there's a Benjamin Franklin statue there. So it's really the father of printers, for example. So the publishing industry, the printing industry, and the newspapers were all downtown at that time. And New York Times is being lit up by Thomas Edison's entrepreneurial efforts, commodifying the light bulb, right? So you have in 1882 that kind of effort that's also happening. So we're talking about a very dynamic period in which the newspapers are really widely competing with each other and publishing the latest tidbits of what's happening in the city. And then people are learning about that and then going down and actually visiting the ship. Maybe then you could pick up the story from there. I was just giving some background.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating because, as I said, she was out of circulation for 8 years. The person who was her manager had a connection with Barnum because her manager was also someone who did signage, and he did a lot of signage for Barnum. And that's how Barnum knew, of course, where Afong Moy was. And he brought her out of seclusion into New York at exactly this time, of course, to make this connection with the 1847 keying junk. So she comes to New York. Barnum sets this all up and tries to set it up as though she actually came on the junk. Of course, reporters were smarter than that, and they figured out that actually this was Afong Moy, not someone who had come on the junk. But what Barnum tried to do was to make a connection between Afong Moy and a person on the junk who was perhaps sort of the assistant captain, a Chinese person, Eshing, or he had many different names in the press. But what happened was that Barnum tried to set this up so it looked like there might be a marriage relationship between Afong Moy and this person who had come from China. As Barnum, who is the master marketer and trying every way he can to have crowds see his performer, and that's what he did. He put Afong Moy in a performance mode in a salon at the American Museum in New York. And so, he hyped the rumor about Afong Moy and this person. People did know that this was the same woman who 8 years earlier had been in New York and traveled around the United States. The Chinese sailors had been duped, and they resisted the captain of the ship, saying they were owed money, and there was a scuffle, and the Chinese sailors were arrested. You would think that that would be the end of the story, and that the Chinese sailors would not have had agency to do anything. Jack, do you want to pick up on that? Because I think the really interesting part is what happens with the Chinese sailors.
We're talking about the 1840s now. The Chinese sailors really push back. There's actually coverage of them pushing back and really saying how they had been duped and taken advantage of, and giving some context, I think, to some insight into the kind of port culture and the kind of circulation of sailors all throughout the world. As we know from Herman Melville and Moby Dick, these crews were not simply European, American, Yankee boys, on these ships. They were international crews because ship captains were pretty horrific oftentimes. And from port to port, jumping around in the coastal trade, there'd be crews getting on, crews leaving, people just getting disgusted. And necessarily then there was a kind of internationalization of the crews themselves. So Queequeg was not an anomaly in Moby Dick. It was actually quite common for these crews to be multinational and to speak to each other in a language that they figured out across cultural differences, oftentimes called pidgin. If you look at a book by, for example, the trilogy by Amitav Ghosh, a brilliant writer, fiction writer, but it's really historical fiction. He really communicates largely in with his characters in Pidgin in a way that gives you a sense of how complicated and how nuanced the international port cultures and ships really were. These are very sophisticated sailors. They've seen the world. They've been probably involved in staying in one place or another outside of China for periods of time. And they arrive in the port of New York really being treated as part of Barnum's show, as you're saying, but they quickly push back because these are not people who are voluntarily being a part of the commercial culture. They're really much more savvy and much more direct people who have been working on these crews and seeing the world. So they bring their own kind of cosmopolitanism, and it's not about speaking French or French education. It's really being aware of the Pacific worlds, the Indian Ocean worlds, but also the Atlantic worlds. So these are people who've really spoken to each other and traded stories and are quite aware of the kind of injustice that's oftentimes waged. Yes. So they really arrive on the shores of New York and begin defending themselves and defending their own positions. And these are cases that go on in the public's eye, and also in the protests. Many of them become indigent, and then there's fundraising efforts for them. Some of them then kind of drift into becoming among the first residents in Lower Manhattan who are of Asian descent. We're not necessarily talking about Chinese, we're talking about probably a mixture of backgrounds is my guess, but I'd have to go back and try to dig that out and try to see what those mixtures are. And they're seen as highly transgressive in the Western cultural context. I mean, if you get to, let's say, the Taiping Rebellion and someone like, who takes on the pseudonym in British culture of Sax Rohmer, who then starts writing about the rebellion in China and how you have also opium being smuggled into the East End of London, and Chinese somehow get identified as the people who are introducing the opium, oblivious of the fact that it's the British who are marketing opium, right? The master marketers of opium globally. And you get the figure of Fu Manchu emerging from that. And the henchmen for Fu Manchu are oftentimes described as lascars and sepoys. And these are the people that come straight out of the maritime world of the Indian Ocean and are part of really this group of people who are quite worldly and quite knowledgeable. But they, with Fu Manchu, who's seen as a Mandarin, who's seen as educated in the best Western universities, is represented as the leader, kind of like a despot, kind of an emperor type for this group of ragged people from all over, Arabs, Blacks, various kinds of Asians, South Asians, real mixture of people who are seen as the dangerous hordes who are occupying the districts of Western ports now. So from London to Liverpool to New York City to Havana, these are the port culture denizens who are increasingly seen as a threat to the Anglo-American world that they've claimed. My work since the time I wrote New York Before Chinatown has really kind of expanded into trying to understand who these people were and how in many ways they created the culture of a lot of the street culture and fashion culture and culture that we love so much about New York City, but they've never been given the proper credit. But it was really out of that port culture that also a new kind of aesthetic and a new kind of commerce begins to emerge. That's more about this globalization of port cultures than about what's particularly Knickerbocker or Anglo-American New York. So just to kind of put the crew in that kind of context. So that's who's arriving, and those are the people who are kind of standing up for their rights in New York.
What I really appreciated in looking a little bit into this was that Samuel Wells Williams, who was a pretty learned person, American, goes to China, spends a great deal of time in China, and actually learns Chinese, comes back at this time in about 1846, 47, comes back to America and is really disheartened by how he sees Americans responding to China. He finds them ridiculing the Chinese, making fun of the Chinese, and it really upsets him. And he writes about this, how upsetting it is to come back after many years and see how the Americans have really sort of castigating the Chinese. But it is Samuel Wells Williams who defends these crew members and becomes their translator, and they go to court, and wonderfully, the crew members win, which is just, and everyone is astounded that they could win in court. And Samuel Wells Williams was really the person who made that happen. Barnum, of course, never expecting that they would win the case, was a little worried about what he was going to do with Afong Moy, since the whole aspect of the king was sort of blown. And so he sends Afong Moy to Boston, and hopes that he will have a public in Boston. The king does go eventually without the crew members that won their case, and they go back to China. It does go eventually to Boston, and there Afong Moy does again speak to an American public about China and about the king a little bit. But what I think is really interesting is Samuel Wells Williams' concern about the way in which Americans now view China. So this is the second phase of Afong Moy's life, and it's sort of a little bit noticeable in the play. At this point, she is made fun of. She's made a farce in many ways. The people are not as tolerant and are not as receptive. And there are poems about her that are making fun of her. And she really now is transformed from a promoter of goods and a purveyor and a descriptor of Chinese life to a spectacle. So there is a big change in the second half of her life. She is paired with Tom Thumb on stage. They has her use chopsticks. He does a 7-page promotional pamphlet on her, and it's quite negative. And it's setting the American public up to see her in a very different way than she had been in her previous in the previous phase of her experience. So I think those two different phases of her life are really an insight. Again, this is the window into the way in which Americans are seeing the Chinese. And this second phase is not good, and it's not positive, and it's pretty destructive.
I wasn't aware that the sign maker for Barnum was the one who ended up managing Afong Moy, but it makes so much sense because we're really talking about the early days of advertising and promotion, and how they really are kind of linking Barnum's quote unquote showmanship, where basically he was a huckster. He was the carnival huckster. He created a museum before he got into the circus world, but it was really a way of kind of spinning stories. The public was interested in lots of things, and the way in which foreign news and colonial explorations in Africa and everything else, all those kinds of stories that were circulating through sea captains and missionaries were also increasingly becoming the subject of his displays. And he would just kind of make up stuff, right, about the missing link, or these albino people who were displayed and meant to be a missing, kind of some connection to some exotic, foreign peoples who are now being brought on display in New York. So the sign maker, who knows who this sign maker was, if he was responsible for this, so typical of Barnum's entrepreneurial hucksterism was that, and this is a story that maybe whether it's true or not, but it's oftentimes said that he would just be playful and get people to really pay for coming to the museum before it got burned down, and just kind of constantly piquing interest, right, and why you should come back to this place. I've yet to confirm, but I will circulate this story nevertheless, if it's not true, that a sign maker had made the sign to the egress, right? And people thought that that was another display that would titillate their interest. But of course, the egress is the exit, right? So once people exited the building, they couldn't get back in. They have to come back in and pay again. It tells the story of his hucksterism, really. And of course, it's politely described as being a showman. Part of why I think it's really important to understand Barnum is that he would put people who were of all sorts of different shapes of their bodies, and also would play up the racialization of difference and also gender differences. And I know this is the area that you really have spent a lot of time on in terms of kind of how women are represented and how their sexuality is played up. And that again is part of the kind of Orientalism, primitivism, exotification of indigenous peoples, African peoples, Asian peoples. That was so much of the coin that Barnum played with as people were trying to sort these questions out in the context of colonial conquest and domination. Part of what I think is significant about this is that the fact that she was played up alongside Tom Thumb, but we could also say with all sorts of other people who had quote unquote deformities or were physically very different and were seen as mentally and culturally and racially inferior as a way for the Anglo-American public and the kind of Western public to kind of see for themselves whether these things were true or not. By watching these displays, and in some ways we do have to talk about museums in this way, because this was the American Museum. In some ways, I think we think of museums as more serious places, but museums have these kinds of limits as well in terms of how we understand the world and how they classify difference and everything else, and how they make the viewers feel superior oftentimes, right? So the fact that these were all being played out in his museum also foreshadows and anticipates the immigration exclusion law. So not only in 1882 are Chinese excluded, and it's really Chinese merchants are not, and Chinese educated people are not, so that it's really Chinese laborers who are considered kind of racially inferior and racially different. But also there are all sorts of anxieties about admitting into this vastly expanding New York City population, but in the Northeast especially, people who are going to contribute to the degeneracy of the nation. Degeneracy is something that's used a lot with eugenics beginning in 1882. But also this thought that somehow there are stages of civilization, and people who are, for example, are considered mongoloid idiots, for example, people with Down syndrome, are kind of degenerating from white people to an earlier stage of racial development. You know, so mongoloid was seen as a half stage up towards a higher civilization or Mongolism, but also people of different sizes and shapes and all that were put on display as well. We know that in terms of the New York Zoological Society, they would be putting on various people on display as part of the zoological comparison of humans to apes, for example. The immigration laws in the 1880s also began to kind of talk about people who were insane, people who were mentally inferior, and diseased, trying to keep those people out, right? And that was preceded by the 1875 Page Act, which is also trying to keep Asian Chinese women out. And this is where Afong Moy was kind of caught in this increasingly negative framing of Asian women being identified as really inferior, but alluring and attractive. So there's kind of both things going on and potentially contributing to degeneration, but also, quite frankly, really not wanting Asians and Chinese to begin to settle and create families in North America, really. In Anglo-North America. So gender, sexuality, race, kind of civilizational differences, all those things were being played out by Barnum to his personal profit. Whereas these were really larger social and cultural kind of anxieties and concerns that people had coming from so many different parts of the world and being played out on the stage to kind of sort out their understanding of the world, right? So, yeah.
Reading the 9 or 7 page brochure, most of it on Afong Moy, does talk about her heathenism, the way in which she dresses, and all of these things in a negative way, and certainly presents the foil of the American way. A fascinating way of presenting his featured person. What I think is really interesting in this case is that Barnum realizes that Afong Moy is a commodity that people, I'm using that in a negative way that he would use it, is someone who has been seen and has kind of run her term. And so he brings in another Chinese woman, supposedly from China, with bound feet, and supplants Afong Moy with this new woman, new Chinese woman, who sings and is supposedly, again, from, the top echelons of Chinese life. And so she now travels to London under Barnum, and Afong Moy is completely eliminated as any feature in his great panoply of performers. She just is sidelined. And that is really the end of her performance experience, by 1851, 1852, 1851, really. You don't see her because her place has been taken by someone else. This is typical of Barnum. He does this. He tried to do it with Tom Thumb. It didn't work because the American public loved Tom Thumb and wouldn't allow another substitute for Tom Thumb. And so Barnum had to bring him back. But that did not happen with Afong Moy. They didn't have that kind of allegiance to Afong Moy that they did to Tom Thumb. And so the public did not remonstrate about her leaving the Barnum panoply. It is a really interesting aspect of how Barnum works and how publicity works and how show business works, and the way in which people were just disposable in his way of thinking.
Yeah, and could you mention that a reporter made a quip about the second Afong Moy, which also speaks to the kind of playfulness and suspicion, but also the question of who are cons, who's tricking who, and who are confidence men and confidence women in the culture of New York City.
When this woman was brought in by Barnum, supposedly she came on a vessel to New York City. I actually did research this and found the name of the vessel, but there was no evidence of this woman on that ship. But the reporter at the time said, it's kind of interesting because this woman has sort of a New York accent. She may be Chinese, but I heard her speak and she sounded like she was from New York, which is sort of interesting, that he picked up that Barnum had always done this sleight of hand and that this was likely another sleight of hand. And, they were onto his methods. Whether that's the truth or not, I can't say, but it is interesting that I have not been able to find any evidence of that group coming into New York at the time when Barnum was supposedly bringing in this family.
Part of the genius of Barnum, but also earlier in terms of what was going on in New York, is the marketing of this commercial culture of putting people on display, but also products, the product placement kind of part of all this.
Mhm.
And then the traveling shows that would happen, so that being packaged in New York and then traveling and making the arrangements for that was something that was happening throughout the 19th century. And you know, I think part of how American culture, commercial culture, really emerges, right? I don't know if you want to talk about that, because it also has to do with how Afong Moy, before she was discarded, was also traveling, and what she would sell and what her experiences were. This is also happening to the quote unquote Siamese twins,
Yeah.
as well, which now there's more scholarship about, but something that, you know, we're looking at bits and pieces of stories that have been largely kind of ignored, and the stereotypes that are generated around those basic stories, and then digging into the actual lives and experiences of these people, and looking at the dissonance, and how they were represented through an Orientalist culture, both either admiringly or disparagingly, right? And then what those experiences of these people really are, which are actually hard to get at because we just don't have that much about it.
Well, we know a little bit about the way she was presented, because we do have, of course, these great access to newspaper articles. And in Philadelphia, this would be the second time she'd been seen outside of New York. So it was 1835. There was a big article in the Philadelphia papers noting that several physicians, Philadelphia physicians, would unwrap her bound foot and measure it to see if it really was 4 inches, because the public had the right to know whether they were being flim-flammed or not. That did happen in Philadelphia. Her feet were unwrapped, and then the big announcement was, yes, indeed, they are very small. So that was done in private, and certainly that was not something that would have ever been acceptable in China. It was very private. You did not unwrap your feet. This was a complete taboo. So it happened in Philadelphia in private. The really terrible thing is that later, when she went to Charleston, she perhaps was now under a new management, and they forced her to unwrap her bound feet in public, which at the time, the newspaper articles made big headlines that this was going to happen. And then a day later made a notice that this was really objectionable to Afong Moy. It was really disturbing to her. At least they noted that. They also noted that because it was so disturbing to her, she would get the money for that particular performance. Oh, I'm sure that didn't, I mean, I doubt she ever got that money, but that was the excuse they made to sort of negate the shamefulness of this episode. So she did unwrap her feet to the public in Charleston. This was not too different from the way in which the Siamese twins had to undergo the same kind of investigation by medical practitioners before they performed, to see if they really were conjoined. But the two episodes, the Philadelphia one, the Charleston one, and then later, actually, it seemed to have happened perhaps in the South, perhaps in Mobile as well. Physicians also in Charleston, but now, you know, just kind of there as affirming that, yes, indeed, the same size as they were in Philadelphia. So it just was a really intrusive, horrible episode for Afong Moy. So humiliating, and something she could do nothing about because she was bound to this manager who was not going to defend her against the desire for money.
This whole issue of putting women on display, which has a deep kind of racialized history in the Western context. Also, if we were to think about, let's say, I mean, bound feet, I mean, that has its own history, which deserves, serious attention in terms of the mutilation of women's bodies in China, and certain kinds of women, especially, and its sexual connections and all that. It's not the same, but it's connected to the corseting of women in the Western culture and the ribs that would sometimes be broken, and the difficulty of just breathing, right, in such a extremely kind of constrained breaking of the natural shape. So I just want to kind of drop that in there, because bound feet could be understood as simply an example of the barbarism of the Chinese culture, as if our own culture in the West has nothing to do with that. I think what we're both calling for is really just being honest and talking about both cultures at the same time, and not thinking of one culture as the other that we are not like whatsoever. But in fact, there are affinities across cultural differences and within the cultures that are so important to kind of acknowledge as well.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is, so she's going south, but then she comes north to the Northeast. And at that point, she's in Providence, and she can speak a bit in English. And in Providence, they're a little bit kinder than they have been in other places. They talk again about her bound feet, and the newspapers note that she says, yeah, what about your corsets? So she makes the connection. Yes, bound feet, you have bound waists. And so she says this, and the newspapers pick it up. So she's saying this and acknowledging that there are similarities here, and we must not be, so confined to our experience as not to see yours. That gaze back. They may be gazing at her, but she's gazing back. She sees the way these women look when they come, and she knows how they've been tortured. So I think that is a really interesting aspect of her experience, that at this point she has the ability to hit back with that comment.
You mentioned how the Siamese twins were also being looked at as they traveled around, and at a certain point they're managing themselves, and they also married two sisters from the South, but they were still being subject to doctors' investigation. So in some ways, we're not strictly talking about the ignorant public, quote unquote. We're talking about middle class people who could afford to go into these museums for 50 cents, but also doctors who were brought in to give that authentic examination, that these were true human specimens to be collected in a museum or on display at a zoo or put on stage. So in some ways, it's not simply the lower class, déclassé sideshow, but this is really a hope that this was expressed in the range of cultural production work and cultural display and cultural research that were connected to universities as well. The most atrocious, horrific examples of how the twins were treated was when they passed away. And of course, they shared a ligament between their bodies. And when one died first and the other eventually died, there's a lot of fascination about such human anomalies. But what happened in Philadelphia again was that they were subject to a lot of newspaper attention, and autopsies were done. And to this day, their liver is available to be seen and to be researched in the collection of the Mutter Museum, which is actually a very important museum I recommend people going to. But they were also, for a while, put on display as two conjoined bodies that had died. So there's that kind of fascination that the public had of people while they're alive, but also there became an opportunity for the medical establishment, and the Mutter Museum was connected to the School of Physicians in Philadelphia to be put on display as well. So this is not something that was just crass commercialism, but also part of the kind of elite culture of doctors who were looking at racial differences and human differences as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you mentioned the Mutter Museum, since I spent a lot of time there,
Oh, okay.
because I found an amazing letters, more than one, letters by a surgeon who was on board a ship that was in China. So he was, a staff person on the ship. And he wrote letters back and forth to his family, to his fiance, his family in Philadelphia. And in one of the letters, he writes about the fact that he really wanted to see more about this bound foot. Somehow he, maybe in Macau, where he might have had access, he approached a woman, a Chinese woman, and asked if she would unbind her feet, and he would pay her a lot of money. Actually, I think it was I'm not positive, $20, and that money was huge, huge, and she refused to do that. And he writes about the fact that he was so surprised, and since he offered this money, she refused it. And he goes on to say that this was, a very private thing. And so I was fascinated that a doctor tries in China to do this and was refused by a Chinese woman for money. He just goes on to talk a lot about his experiences in China, and his feelings about what went on there. And later, there is also a really interesting poem by Mitchell in Philadelphia about the life of Afong Moy and the comparison between her living in China. This is made up somewhat because he doesn't really know Afong Moy, but the life in China, and he's also a doctor, and her life here. And in the poem, he compares the kind of experience that she would have had in China with the kind of experience she had in America. And he talks about her bound feet and how challenging that must be for her to have shown them. And so this poem is really fascinating, that it speaks to the issues of bound feet and how challenging it is for a woman who is private to have had to forced to open herself up to a very flagrant experience.
Nancy, part of what's really important about your research is that you went to, you also looked at Afong Moy in the context of Cuba. And this brings us back to the Atlantic world and the circulation in so many different ways. The Carnes family was also trying to play with French Parisian culture, the elite culture, but then we're also talking about the slumming quality of how these displays were used and profited from. But maybe you can talk a little bit about Cuba. And I just love this discussion. I know we could both keep on going in terms of two historians talking about a time period that they normally don't get a chance to talk about.
She did go to Cuba, and the Cubans really appreciated her there. As she was presented in a salon, a very private space. The Cubans did not appreciate the fact that women would go out and be separated or presented on stage. So people came to her, to the place where she was staying. And there was just an appreciation in the newspapers for the fact that she'd come so far and that she was presenting information to them. I'm not sure how it was translated, though. They must have had someone who might have known a little bit of Chinese. There weren't any Chinese, or many Chinese, if any, in Cuba at that time. So I'm not sure exactly how this happened. Afong Moy did not have a tongue there at the time. But what was interesting is that the Carnes had sent ahead, or were selling, we know through newspapers, they were selling a lot of materials from their shipments, from their ships to Cuba, probably shawls, and she would have likely been showing those in that experience in Cuba.
There were Chinese brought as replacement workers to enslaved folks on the Spanish plantations and throughout Latin America. So, and those Chinese who were brought in then became part of the kind of rebellion efforts that were also made. So they were really resistant to the indentureships, which is really a form of contract slavery that happened. So there may have been Chinese, some of the very early Chinese who stayed there, and in Peru did enter into opening up small stores and things like that, corner shops. So it's hard to say, right, whether they had any influence or not. I mean, it seems unlikely.
Yeah, and it just is the way I understand it. They may have come like 2 years after she left. So it was very close in time, but I don't get the sense that there were, at that point, they had brought the Chinese there. Could have been a few, but the whole bringing of Chinese to take care, to work in the sugar plantations was a tiny bit later. So we just don't know quite how they were managing the translation, but in any case, they really appreciated her history, I think.
You know, we should wrap up a little bit and just, I don't know if you want to say anything about the play. I know you had a session with Josephine Lee before about the play.
It's a wonderful play. It really is so fantastic. And I've seen it twice, once in Milwaukee, once in Philadelphia. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to get to New York, but it was very different in both places. So I'm sure it's different in New York, but the presentation is fabulous. So I want to thank Mayi Theater and the Public Theater for coordinating this conversation. It's been a wonderful opportunity. And we want to thank the audience for joining us, and we're going to see you at the theater.
I just want to say give a little shout out to Mayi Theater. I really appreciate their productions in general, because I think they take history and colonialism and racism very seriously in a way that doesn't kind of fall into the traps that so much of New York theater falls into, in which these voices and perspectives have always been underestimated and not taken seriously. And even within Asian American theater, I think Mayi has really paved the way for taking the history of these experiences more seriously. And they've had the advantage of being a more recent kind of production group that has been able to look at the research in books and kind of larger discourse that's been really pushing back on racism and colonialism in a serious way. So I really appreciate how the writing and the quality of the production work is at a really kind of path-breaking level. That's part of why I kind of immediately said, yes, so let's be involved in this discussion. But also, Nancy, I'm just so appreciative of the research you've done. And I see all of our work as really part of the cultural production process, which can push back on the racism and not simply converge with the kind of commercial Orientalism or the political Orientalism that has been so dominant in our culture and continues to this day. And I just want to say that I think we're entering into a dangerous moment right now. I just heard, we both heard of the story of people who are involved in this public theater production and how they were actually attacked on the streets of New York. And that's something that in the amount of time I've been living in New York since 1975, it wasn't happening that much. Of course, there are random issues that happen in communities in which one group is pitted against another group. But this kind of public attack of people with Asian bodies and Asian faces and demeanors is really unprecedented. And I worry about what this means in terms of New York being a bellwether of extreme anti-Asianism, but also the ways in which China is increasingly being seen as an enemy, both a commercial rival and an enemy, therefore, of that kind, but also as a military rival. And, you know, with global warming happening in the way we have, and that being kind of a global issue as well as global pandemics, this kind of petty nationalism is just alarming, because I think it's going to keep us away from being able to grapple with the real questions that are confronting us.
You're absolutely right. Thank you so much.
A pleasure, Nancy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.